Pierce Brosnan, the man who restored 007 to global dominance, wore the tuxedo not as a role but as a discipline forged through pressure, loss, and absolute control. He didn't step into a legend. He rebuilt it with a composure so refined it felt almost untouchable. But before he became Bond, he was a boy left behind by his own father, learning silence before he ever learned how to win, carrying a void that never truly closed. Audiences remember the cold gaze, the half-smile, the flawless precision of a Bond who never revealed a crack, but they never saw the hospital corridors where time seemed to stall, where he held the hand of his wife and then his daughter in moments that could not be held on to no matter how tightly he tried, as the same ruthless illness took them both, leaving behind a silence nothing could reach. Now at 72, after surviving abandonment, loss, and blows that came without warning, another void surfaces, clearer than ever. Not from what was lost, but from the very thing that once defined him. A 47-second phone call was enough to erase a part of the man he had built, raising the question of what still refuses to let him go. Every life shaped by absence begins quietly, and for Brosnan it began in a small Irish town with the sound of a door closing behind a father who never returned. Born on May 16, 1953, in Drogheda, Ireland, he entered a life with very little to hold on to and almost immediately without the man whose name he carried. His father, Thomas Brosnan, left before he could remember. No goodbye, no explanation, just absence. His mother, May, worked as a nurse, trying to hold things together, but when he was 4, she left for London in search of work, promising to return. She meant it, but soon became 7 years. During that time, he moved between homes, never long enough anywhere to feel it was his, learning not to ask and not to expect. One quiet evening stayed with him, a small boy standing in a doorway, waiting. At first it felt normal, then longer, then too long, until the house fell silent and the truth settled. No one was coming back. He didn't cry or call out. He simply turned away, and without realizing it, he stopped waiting. When his mother returned years later with William Carmichael, life grew steadier. William was kind and patient, never trying to replace anyone, but trust came slowly. That same year, he took Brosnan to see Goldfinger, where Sean Connery's James Bond carried something he lacked: certainty and control. By 16, that idea pushed him to London's St. Martin's School of Art, where he initially pursued painting. Acting came by accident in 1971 when he wandered into a theater workshop and tried fire eating on impulse. What emerged wasn't skill but presence, a stillness shaped long before training. He joined the Drama Centre London, one of the toughest programs, where many left, but he stayed, working relentlessly because he had already learned how to endure. His path to the screen built slowly. Early roles were small, including a brief appearance alongside Elizabeth Taylor, but he kept going without assuming anything would last. In 1982, he landed the lead role in Remington Steele, which made him widely known and positioned him as a potential James Bond. Yet timing worked against him. Opportunities came close, then slipped away. For years, he carried the possibility without chasing it until 1994, when the role finally returned. With GoldenEye, he revived a fading franchise, earning global success and redefining Bond for a new generation. But when it finally arrived, it didn't bring triumph so much as stillness, as if the thing he had been moving toward had quietly caught up with him. Behind that success, his personal life held both grounding and devastation. He married Cassandra Harris in 1980, embracing her children as his own, and building a life that felt stable for the first time. But in 1987, she was diagnosed with ovarian cancer, beginning years of hospital corridors, treatments, and quiet endurance. He stayed by her side until her death in 1991, holding everything together without breaking where others could see. Years later, the same illness returned, this time taking his daughter, Charlotte Brosnan, in 2013. The pattern was almost unbearable, repeating itself with eerie precision. He didn't collapse. He simply stayed, carrying the weight in silence, as grief became something that didn't leave but lived alongside everything else. Even beyond loss through death, Another kind of absence emerged through his son Christopher, whose struggles with addiction created a distance that could not be bridged. Brosnan remained present, trying everything, until he reached the moment every parent fears, when someone you love is still there, but no longer reachable. He didn't walk away, but he learned to stand at a distance, holding on to hope without the ability to fix what was broken. Then in 2004, another loss arrived, quieter but deeply cutting. After 4 Bond films and global success, a brief phone call ended his tenure. No warning, no explanation, just a thank you and goodbye. It wasn't just the loss of a role, but the realization that it had already been taken from him before he was told. Watching Casino Royale years later, he didn't react outwardly. There was no anger, only recognition that something he had built no longer belonged to him. Today, at 72, Brosnan stands as more than the man who revived Bond. His estimated fortune reflects decades of disciplined work, from films to production ventures and carefully chosen roles, as well as a quiet expansion into art and property. His Malibu home, built over years, is less a display of wealth and more a refuge shaped by intention. His lifestyle remains restrained, focused on family, creativity, and continuity rather than reinvention. At the center of his life is his enduring marriage to Keely Shea Smith, a partnership grounded in steadiness rather than spectacle. What defines him now is not success or image, but the quiet discipline of continuing. A life admired from the outside often carries a weight no one sees, and in Brosnan's case, what remains is not the roles he played, but the way he absorbed everything without turning it into spectacle. Because sometimes, what endures is not what a man builds, but how he keeps standing long after everything else has fallen away. What time does to a man like Pierce Brosnan is not obvious at first glance. From the outside, the image remains intact. Measured voice, composed presence, a life that appears settled into its later years with quiet control. But beneath that stillness, time has not softened anything, it has only rearranged it. The losses did not fade. They changed position, becoming less visible but more deeply rooted, no longer events that happened, but conditions that remained. What once arrived as shock has become something quieter, something constant, woven into the way he moves through each day without needing to be acknowledged. There is a difference between surviving something and outliving it. Survival suggests an end point, a moment where the worst has passed. But for him, there was no clear separation between before and after. The past does not sit behind him. It exists alongside him, present in ways that don't ask for attention but never fully release their hold. It shows up in pauses that last a second longer than expected, in the way he listens more than he speaks, in the absence of urgency even when there is reason for it. Nothing is rushed because he has already learned what rushing cannot prevent. In his later years, his work reflects that same shift. The roles are fewer, more deliberate, less concerned with scale, and more with presence. There is no longer a need to prove range or command attention. That need belonged to an earlier version of himself, one that believed effort could secure permanence. Now, there is an understanding that nothing holds indefinitely, not roles, not recognition, not even the identities we spend years building. What remains is the ability to show up fully in whatever space still exists. His creative life has also turned inward. Painting, something that existed before acting, has returned not as a career but as a necessity. It offers something film never could: control without expectation, expression without performance. On canvas, there is no audience waiting, no role to maintain, no narrative to complete. Just movement, color, and the quiet act of placing something into the world without needing it to be understood. It is not escape. It is alignment with a part of himself that existed before everything else complicated it. Family, too, has taken on a different shape. Not defined by perfection or completeness, but by presence. The children who remain, the relationships that endured, are not taken for granted. They are held carefully, without assumption, without the illusion that they are immune to change. Love, in this stage of his life, is not something expressed loudly. It is something maintained, through consistency, through showing up, through staying even when nothing needs to be said. There is also a quiet acceptance that some questions will never resolve. Why certain losses repeated? Why some distances could not be closed? Why certain endings came without warning? These are not questions he appears to chase anymore. Not because they have answers, but because he has learned that understanding them would not change their weight. Instead, he carries them without trying to reduce them, allowing them to exist without forcing meaning onto them. And perhaps that is where his strength now lives, not in resilience as it is often described, but in restraint. The refusal to dramatize what has already been endured. The decision to continue without needing to rebuild everything into something new. He does not appear to be searching for redemption, reinvention, or even closure. Those ideas belong to narratives that suggest life can be neatly resolved. His life does not follow that structure, and he no longer seems interested in making it do so. What remains is something quieter and more difficult to define. A man who once learned how to stop waiting has still chosen, again and again, to keep moving forward. Not toward something specific, not toward a final outcome, but simply forward. Because motion, even without direction, is sometimes the only thing that prevents everything from standing still. And in that, there is a kind of truth that does not need to be spoken out loud. That strength is not always visible in what a person achieves, but in what they continue to carry without setting it down. That some lives are not defined by what they overcome, but by what they absorb and live alongside. And that sometimes, the most enduring form of control is not over circumstances, but over the choice to remain present within them. For Pierce Brosnan, the story does not resolve into a single meaning or a final statement. It continues, quietly, without announcement. Not as the legend he once embodied, not as the roles that defined him, but as something more enduring, a man who remains, even when so much else has already fallen away. And as the years move forward, what becomes most striking about Pierce Brosnan is not what he has lost or even what he has rebuilt, but what he no longer feels the need to recover. There was a time when identity was tied to momentum, roles, recognition, the forward motion of a career that seemed to define its own purpose. But that momentum has long since slowed, and in its place is something far more deliberate. Not absence, not withdrawal, but a kind of stillness that no longer asks to be filled. He does not speak as someone trying to make sense of everything that happened. There is no visible attempt to frame it into lessons or conclusions that others can easily carry. Instead, there is a quiet acceptance that some parts of a life resist being shaped into anything clean or understandable. They remain exactly as they are, unfinished, unresolved, and yet fully present. And rather than resisting that, he seems to have made space for it. There is also a noticeable shift in how he relates to the past. It is no longer something to revisit with longing or regret. It sits where it belongs, neither pushed away nor held too tightly. The years of bond, the sudden ending, the moments that once defined him, they no longer appear to demand recognition. They exist as part of a longer arc, one that matters but no longer defines the whole. What once felt central has become something quieter, almost distant, as if time has gently reduced its weight without erasing its significance. In public appearances, there is a calm that does not feel performed. It is not the polished composure of a man maintaining an image, but something more settled. He speaks when necessary, listens more often, and carries himself with the kind of awareness that comes from having already faced what cannot be undone. There is no urgency to assert relevance, no visible need to reclaim space. That absence of urgency is not detachment, it is clarity. Even success, in the way it is commonly understood, seems to hold less importance now. The numbers, the achievements, the recognition, they exist, but they do not appear to anchor him. What matters more is continuity, the ability to wake up, to move through a day, to remain present in a life that has already demanded more than most. That continuity is not dramatic, but it is steady, and in many ways, it is harder to maintain than any visible triumph. There is also something else that emerges with time, a quiet reconciliation with uncertainty. Not the kind that resolves it, but the kind that accepts its permanence. The understanding that not everything can be protected, not everything can be held, and not everything can be explained. And yet, life continues, not because those uncertainties disappear, but because they are allowed to exist without stopping everything else. For a man who once embodied control so completely on screen, this may be the most significant transformation of all. Control is no longer about shaping outcomes or maintaining a perfect exterior. It has become something internal, something quieter, the ability to remain steady even when nothing else is. The ability to carry what cannot be changed without letting it define every moment that follows. And in that, there is a kind of endurance that does not draw attention to itself. It does not ask to be admired or even fully understood. It simply exists day after day in the decisions that are made without announcement. To keep going, to stay present, to not turn away from what remains. So the story does not build toward a final resolution, because there isn't one. There is no moment where everything settles into place, no point where the weight disappears. Instead, there is continuation, quiet, consistent, and real. A life that moves forward not because it has been repaired, but because it has learned how to exist without needing to be. And perhaps that is what lingers most. Not the image of a man who once defined a global icon, not the scale of what he achieved, but the quieter truth beneath it all. That even after everything, after loss, after distance, after the kind of endings that do not announce themselves, Pierce Brosnan is still there. Not unchanged, not untouched, but present. And sometimes, that is the only form of strength that remains. And beyond even that quiet presence, there is something almost imperceptible that defines how Pierce Brosnan exists now, a kind of detachment that is not cold, but earned. It is the result of having once held tightly to things that did not stay, and learning, slowly and without instruction, that holding on does not always keep them from leaving. What replaces that is not indifference, but a gentler grip on everything that remains. He does not appear to measure his life against what it could have been, or even what it once was. That comparison, which often lingers in others, seems to have lost its hold on him. There is no visible attempt to reclaim a former version of himself, no quiet pursuit of restoring what has already passed. Instead, there is a steady acceptance that life does not return to earlier forms, it only continues forward, carrying traces of what came before without ever recreating it. This is perhaps most evident in the way he occupies his own history. The years as bond, the recognition, the cultural imprint, these are not rejected, but they are no longer central. They exist as something completed, something that had its time and shape, and then ended. What remains is not the need to revisit it, but the ability to let it stand where it belongs. That distance is not loss, it is resolution without closure. There is also a deeper understanding now of what cannot be controlled. Earlier in life, control may have meant discipline, precision, the ability to maintain composure regardless of circumstance. Now, it seems to mean something else entirely, the willingness to allow uncertainty, to accept that outcomes will not always align with effort or intention. It is a quieter form of control, one that does not attempt to shape everything, but instead focuses on how one stands within whatever arrives. In the rhythm of his daily life, this shows up in small, almost invisible ways. The absence of excess, the lack of urgency, the preference for spaces that feel contained, personal, removed from noise. These are not choices made for appearance, but for balance. They suggest a life that is no longer trying to expand outward, but to remain steady within itself. And yet, despite everything that has been carried, there is no sense that he has withdrawn from life entirely. If anything, there is a subtle engagement that feels more intentional than before. Conversations that are quieter but more present. Work that is less frequent but more aligned. Relationships that are not defined by perfection, but by continuity. It is not a life reduced, it is a life distilled. There is also something to be said about what he has not become. He has not turned his story into spectacle. He has not framed his losses as something to be displayed or leveraged. He has not sought validation through explaining what cannot truly be explained. That restraint is not avoidance. It is respect for the weight of what he has lived through. Some experiences lose their meaning when they are turned outward too easily, and he seems to understand that instinctively. So what remains is not a man trying to be understood, but one who no longer needs to be. The questions that once might have followed him, about identity, purpose, legacy, no longer appear to demand answers. They exist, but they do not press. They move alongside him, as quiet as everything else that has stayed. And in that, there is a kind of completeness that does not depend on resolution. Not everything has been fixed. Not everything has been explained. But everything has been carried, and that, in itself, has shaped something steady enough to endure. So the story continues, not toward a conclusion, but through a continuation that no longer needs one. A life that is not defined by what it reaches, but by how it holds what remains. And at the center of it, still unchanged in the ways that matter most, is Pierce Brosnan, not as the figure the world once watched, but as the man who remained after everything else had already moved on.